The movie opens in a suburban home where we witness a man named Christian painstakingly grilling a steak. Once he's done, he divides the food into two halves, placing one on a plate and the other in an iron bowl. Christian then puts the bowl on the floor and tells his dog Frank to eat. Shockingly, we realize that Frank is not an ordinary dog, but rather a human dressed and acting like one. He happily begins devouring the food. During this, Christian checks his Tinder profile and flicks through various blondes until he comes across a woman named Sigrid. He finds her quite appealing, so he instantly sends her a super like. We then get to show Christian's regular day, which involves taking care of Frank by giving him snacks and cleaning his teeth. He soon receives notification that Sigrid also likes him. Later that night, Christian writes a text to Sigrid before falling asleep. In the morning, Frank approaches him in bed and awakens him with panting and sniffing sounds, and pleased Christian then brings him his breakfast. He also discovers that Sigrid has reacted to his message and starts speaking with her. They spend the entire day conversing, and she eventually invites him to meet. The next day, we see Christian dressed in a business suit for his date, and he asks Frank how he looks, but the latter merely whimpers. After getting ready, Christian kisses his human dog goodbye and leaves the house. He immediately arrives at a beautiful restaurant and waits for his date. But despite waiting for a long time, she doesn't show up, leaving him frustrated. After some while, Christian decides to depart, but Sigrid suddenly comes up in her sweatpants. She apologizes for being late, and they engage in a friendly chat. However, Sigrid suddenly begins using her phone, which appears a little unpleasant to him. He asks if it's essential, but she apologizes, claiming that it's just a destructive habit. Following this, Sigrid discloses that she's a student and also works part-time as a cashier. She then asks what he does, to which Christian uncomfortably answers that he isn't doing anything right now. He also discloses that he's a bit antisocial and struggles to get along with others, unlike her, who seems quite extroverted and easygoing. As dusk arrives, Christian musters all his confidence to invite Sigrid to his place. She instantly agrees, and upon their arrival, Sigrid is swept away by the beautiful property and knows that Christian is not an average guy. Christian pours wine for her and confesses that his parents are dead and he inherited the house from them. In response, Sigrid admits that her parents split when she was a child, therefore she's not close to them. Here Christian discloses that he also has a dog. Sigrid is pleased to hear this and inquires about the breed, but Christian says that it's a bit complicated and that she'll understand when she meets him. Meanwhile, we witness Frank listening to their chat via the door. As the two continue talking, Christian suddenly takes the initiative to kiss her, and they start making love as Frank creepily observes everything. When Sigrid wakes up the next morning, she discovers Frank in front of her. This terrifies her shitless, but Christian acts as if nothing is strange. Sigrid is horrified to witness a man costumed and acting like a dog. She asks Christian what's happening and who this person is. However, he responds that it's his pet and acts as if it is a normal thing. Terrified, Sigrid promptly leaves the house, pretending she has some work. Frank explains the matter, but Sigrid shuts him down. Instead, she begs Christian to give her a ride to her house. When Sigrid arrives at her flat, she meets her roommate, Aurora. The latter asks how the date went, and Sigrid is filled with mixed thoughts. She reveals that the guy was gorgeous, and they got along really well. However, the peculiar aspect is that he has a pet who is a person dressed in a dog suit. This surprises Aurora, and she demands to see a photo of the man. And as soon as she does, she recognizes the guy as the son of a prominent multimillionaire. Aurora can't believe her pal went on a date with such a rich man. Even Sigrid is astonished, as she was ignorant of this fact. Next, the two pals watch a video on YouTube discussing a term called puppy play, where people dress up and imitate the qualities of a dog. Sigrid thinks it unusual, but Aurora believes that people can do anything they want as long as they don't damage others. She tells Sigrid not to be so narrow-minded and let this attractive millionaire slip away due to her preconceptions. After this, Sigrid begins to think on her friend's counsel, exactly as she receives a call from Christian, who wants to make amends. She also apologizes for leaving so abruptly, so Christian reassures her that it's his responsibility for not clarifying everything up front. To make it up to her, he offers her to supper at his place tomorrow, which she enthusiastically accepts. The following day, we see Aurora and Sigrid studying, but Sigrid appears distracted. Sigrid tells us that she and Christian have patched things up, and he has invited her to supper. This delights Aurora, and she quips that if Sigrid marries him, she might live off his riches and won't have to study anymore. Not long later, Christian arrives to pick her up, and they proceed to his place. As they have supper, Sigrid questions about the human dog, so Christian explains that, while it may appear unusual to her, it is fully Frank's choice to be like this. He doesn't have anyone else in his life and wants Christian to take care of him. Sigrid understands his circumstances and asks if she can meet Frank. Christian accepts, but advises her not to treat him like a human, but like a real dog. Although Sigrid is afraid, she decides to give him a chance and pets him. But then, like an ecstatic dog, Frank leaps onto her lap and starts sniffing her. This makes Sigrid very uncomfortable, so Christian scolds Frank and instructs him to back off. Christian appears upset about what happened, so he offers to take Sigrid home, but she prefers to stay with him and embraces this weird situation. Sigrid asks how they met, so Christian replies he met Frank as a child, and they were both losers. He technically had friends because he had fancy toys and chocolates, but once it ceased, everyone abandoned his side except Frank, making him his true friend. Sigrid spends the night once again, and the next morning, Christian surprises her with breakfast in bed. Shortly after, he brings Frank in, stating the dog wants to apologize for yesterday's conduct. Sigrid is a little terrified by this, so she swiftly forgives him. She then realizes that she's almost late for class, so Christian drives her to college. In the next scene, Aurora invites Sigrid to hang out with their friends, but our girl apologizes and explains she has arrangements with Christian. Aurora tells Sigrid not to be too easy, because rich males like him are used to obtaining what they want. Later, when Sigrid goes to meet Christian, he shows her his collection of books that belong to his mother. During this, Sigrid suddenly remembers her friend's advice and begs him to drive her home as darkness is falling. But Christian demands that she stay at his apartment, and in the end, she finds herself obeying. Later on, Christian tells her that Frank has been through a lot and that no one has been there for him. He acknowledges that he doesn't understand why Frank chose to live as a dog, but he still supports him. Christian then recommends a trip to the countryside with Frank and him, which Sigrid agrees to. The next morning, Aurora teases with Sigrid about playing hard to get, and they both hug before Sigrid goes for her trip with Christian. The three of them went off on their vacation, leaving the city behind. After a long drive, they arrive at a gorgeous house in the middle of the forest. Sigrid is amazed by the setting and decorating, but during dinner, she keeps looking through her phone, which frustrates Christian. He advises that they spend time together without interruption for only this weekend. Sigrid is a bit hesitant, but eventually delivers him the phone, which he places in a box and locks somewhere. In the evening, we observe Sigrid and Frank playing in the living room, while Christian watches them with love. He then proceeds to the kitchen to get some wine. But then, during this time, Sigrid is astonished by the revelation, and at the same time, Christian returns with the wine. She's still absorbing what she just heard. Overwhelmed by the circumstances, she says she's too weary out and heads to bed upstairs. Sigrid gets up extremely early in the morning and discovers that Christian is still asleep. She silently makes her way downstairs and tries to escape. However, as she reaches the front door, she is horrified to discover it locked. Sigrid begins to seek for the keys, but she's tragically discovered by Christian. He explains that he always locks the door for safety and wonders what she's doing. The girl hesitantly responds she needed to get some fresh air, so Christian takes her outside. Sigrid then begs Christian for her own key, claiming she doesn't like to wake him awake. But he explains that he only has one copy and tells her that he doesn't mind being interrupted. He then proceeds to kiss her. Sigrid is so horrified that she instantly vomits upon returning home. During breakfast, Christian realizes how upset Sigrid is. She doesn't eat anything and demands for her phone. Christian resists, as predicted, but she explains that her mother is ailing and only wants to check on her. Upon hearing this, Christian begrudgingly brings the phone but dials Mom himself and puts it on loudspeaker. This leaves poor Sigrid with little alternative but to anxiously start talking. From their talk, it quickly becomes clear that Mom is fine and healthy. Christian says he's disappointed with Sigrid for lying. He thinks she's addicted to the phone and takes it away from her again. Soon later, Sigrid asks her boyfriend if she can take Frank for a walk. Christian agrees without hesitation, and the two head off for a walk in the forest. After reaching a bit further, Sigrid asks Frank if she should remove his leash so he can walk normally, but he thinks she's being too loud and tells her to be quiet. He then speaks in a quiet voice and cautions her that Christian is probably observing them. Frank asks whether she has a plan, and Sigrid explains that they may escape away right now. But Frank cautions that Christian is ready for such a circumstance and that the only way out is to murder him. This freaks Sigrid out, and she claims that she would never do anything like that. Shortly later, they return to the house, and Christian finds out that Frank hasn't gone to the bathroom. He chooses to handle it himself and goes outdoors. Meanwhile, Sigrid seizes this chance and takes a kitchen knife. She hastily walks upstairs to the bedroom and hides it under her pillow. But seconds later, Christian abruptly appears, saying he wants to change the linens. A horrified Sigrid offers to do it herself because he does all the cleaning. Christian is apprehensive at first, as he expects everything to be flawless, but finally accepts. After changing the linens, she heads to the shower. But later, she is summoned by Christian, who says he wants to talk. She anxiously steps out, and Sigrid believes he has spotted the knife, but it turns out Christian found a wrinkle in the sheet. He yells at her, stating she promised not to leave defects, but Christian soon chuckles and claims he's just joking. As if that wasn't enough, he starts kissing her and wants to become personal. Sigrid is reluctant and says she's wet, but he tries to force himself on her. In the end, an enraged Sigrid slaps him hard. Christian feels really embarrassed by this, but he quietly exits to prepare dinner. In the next scene, we see the two of them sharing an uneasy supper. Sigrid compliments the wine and inquires about Frank, to which Christian says that he is asleep. Shortly after, she tries to get up, but suddenly feels dizzy and falls asleep, so Christian promptly puts her in bed. Sigrid wakes up early the next morning and desperately hunts for the knife under her pillow. To her horror, it's not there anymore. All of a sudden, Christian wakes up and says he wants to show her something. He then leads her downstairs, where he plays a recording of the discussion in which Frank requested Sigrid to kill him. He also takes out the knife she hid and says he's really disappointed in her. Christian reveals that although he could have tied her up, he decided not to, since he still considers her to be trustworthy. Next, Christian leads her to a back room, where it is discovered that he has imprisoned Frank in a cage. He argues that he didn't need the recording because the loyal dog revealed everything thereafter. He then tells Sigrid that, unlike the dog, she will receive her punishment for disloyalty. After this, Christian opens Frank's cage and even takes off his mask. He begins to pet him, complimenting how wonderful a dog he is, but Frank takes advantage of the situation and bites Christian, leading to a fight between them. Witnessing this, Sigrid abandons Frank to his destiny and instantly steals the keys to exit the house. She flees into the wilderness and starts crying for help. Christian is about to strangle Frank to death, but he finally releases the unfortunate guy when he vows not to fight back again. However, he soon notices Sigrid has escaped. Frank apologizes for causing this, but it only makes Christian furious. He scolds him for speaking like a human and vows to punish him. Following this, he drags Frank to the nearby barn, while the unfortunate guy continues to scream and beg for mercy. The crazed guy binds him to a chair and blindfolds him. He then shoves a gag in Frank's mouth and wraps headphones around his ears. After this, Christian starts to pour water over him. He then throws a plastic bag over Frank's head and suffocates him. On the other hand, Sigrid can't find her way out of the forest, so she collapses on the ground and begins to cry. Back at the barn, Frank almost dies due to the lack of air, so Christian eventually removes the bag. He then confines Frank in a cage and puts on the headphones himself. After this, Christian tortures him by playing loud music over enormous speakers all throughout the barn. He starts hammering on the cage and barbarically calls for Frank to start barking. Meanwhile, Sigrid hears the loud music and feels awful for the wretched dog. So, she gathers her bravery and chooses to head back and save him. Sigrid picks a large piece of wood and prepares to enter the barn to confront Christian. In the meantime, Christian moves on to the next punishment, which is slapping the dog's ass many times. Upon her arrival, Sigrid is shocked to see him slapping Frank's ass and abusing him. Determined to end this, she creeps up behind the crazed loner and strikes him hard in the head. The strike produces significant damage, and Christian quickly collapses on the floor. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Sigrid tries to help Frank escape. The feeble dog is so physically and mentally injured that he can hardly stand. And regrettably, Christian recovers just in time and punches both of them hard in the head, knocking them out. Overcome with frustration, he collapses on the ground and begins to cry like a kid. In the next scene, some time has passed, and Christian is preparing breakfast. He's still at the forest house, and now Frank is no longer fed human food. Christian carries a bowl of food to the chamber where Frank is locked in a cage. After this, he travels to the barn, where Sigrid turns out to be his new pet. She's wearing her own dog costume and entirely complying, showing no symptoms of disobedience. He offers her the food and says that if she behaves properly, she will be permitted to sleep in the house. Christian then returns to the house and lets a dog out of its cage. He makes a third bowl of dog food and places it on the floor. Moments later, to our horror, a sad young infant crawls in dressed in a dog costume and starts eating the food with his hands. And this is where the movie ends.